We've already heard a little bit about April Dinwoodie, and I'm thrilled to have her with us. In my opinion, April is one of the very most articulate, insightful, and passionate voices in child welfare and adoption today. So I'm just thrilled to have her here this evening. In addition to what you've heard about April and her award, let me share just a couple other things. April recently launched a podcast called June in April. It's got a Facebook presence, and you can download the podcast. She also, actually I've got the book with me, sorry. She was also just published in Black Anthology, Adult Adoptees Claim Their Space. I would highly recommend it. We've got some Ohio adoptees in this book as well. And, oops. And I don't have the rest of my notes. I'm going to give it to April. Thank you.
Given the last few days, all I could think to do was work. I tweeted that earlier today, and I really did. I just had to put my head down and decided that our work in adoption reform and in family and rooted in family is more important than ever. So it's really moving and more meaningful than it would have been, because it would have been that on its own, but being here with you all today specifically makes it more so. As I said, I've always been adopted, and I'm so happy to know that. I had my instincts on this, but if you know when your parents told you, then they probably told you too late. And every time someone asks, I don't remember, so I think that's a good thing. So I give my parents a lot of props. There's a lot of other things I can blame them for, but. So one of the things that I think is really critically important today as we think about the experiences, and never a more poignant time to do so, National Adoption Month, and right around Thanksgiving, when we're going to all, pretty much, I think, sit with our families in that extended period of time, Thursday, Friday, Saturday into the weekend, and be reflecting on family. So when we think about adoption, that's the center of gravity for adoption, is about family. So whether or not we think adoption is part of our world more globally, people say, oh, adoption, that's someone else's family. But no, adoption is connected to all of us in some way, right? Whether we have a personal connection to adoption or not. So I joined the Institute as a sort of recovering marketing communications person. And again, I underestimated how much output emotionally I would expend, but then how much I would get back from that. And the other thing is, when you come into this space, at the point I did in my career to do this work, I looked at things from a different perspective. The Institute's been doing research, policy, and advocacy work for, I don't know how long, 20 years. I do know how long. I need a clicker. Did someone take the clicker? Who took the clicker? Oh no, it's here. It was on the side. It was laying down. Thank you. This one? Okay. So we've been around 20 years, and we've been doing work, research, policy, and advocacy work in areas of the internet and adoption, inter-country adoption, expectant and first birth parent rights. We've been doing a lot of work in foster care. But what I discovered, and we've got a lot of great stats, 400,000 downloads, we've done the tour that we talked about, we launched Let's Adopt Reform, which I'll talk about. But the thing that I was concerned about when I got to the Institute is we've done over 40 publications, that's the bigger publications. We've made 180 recommendations, and I don't think that we have moved things forward far enough or fast enough. So what I was looking at, and we did an analysis of our work, it just seemed like that we know what to do. Like, we don't really need, and obviously this is not being recorded, it is being recorded, darn it.
Sorry. I'll turn it off.
We're a research institute, so I would say, I think we have enough research right now. There are some areas that we need to dig deeper into, expectant and birth parent research, which is not enough. There's not enough of that. There's not enough research in areas like market forces and money. There's new topics to explore, but the bedrock of this work, we know how to do it. It's not about not knowing what to do, it's about doing something about it and using what we know to move reform forward. So that's really the heart of Let's Adopt Reform. It was more about, if we think about action, we've got to know where people are. So we had never really done a large perception survey, and as a former marketing person, I know how important it is to know what people think and where they are, and in order to move them forward. So that's exactly what we did. And part of this also was to say, we've been in rooms like this for a long time with each other in community, but we need to make sure that we're getting our work and our wisdom out to the wider community, because in the spaces where we don't have this kind of unique experience when we're all sharing an experience, we need for people to understand us, and not just the way that sometimes you see in National Adoption Month, which is the finalization of adoptions and the wonderful stories, which are all great and that's good, but there is so much more to that one moment in time, and we have to be able to understand that. So we fielded new research, we went on a national tour, we created a digital experience where everyone can share their voice, and we're putting all that into a report which will be done later this month. The first things first is the research. We had the good fortune, and this is where the public-private partnerships come in that are so important. We had the good fortune of working with one of the most world-renowned organizations, the J. Walter Thompson Group, and they're doing something called Research in Kind, and they give top-tier research to organizations like ours at a fraction of the price. And they were really excited because they had never thought about this. They had just put out a report about the changing dynamics of family, and adoption really wasn't even mentioned. This is what big companies look at in terms of their marketing work. Adoption wasn't mentioned, so they loved digging into this, and we had such a good experience with them and learned a lot. So we surveyed over 2,000 Americans, and we broke that group down into people that actually had a close connection to adoption: birth parents, adoptive people, foster alum, and foster parents. And we put that next to some of the wider American public that didn't have a connection to adoption. And we learned a few things: that 60% of Americans admit they really aren't truly educated about adoption and how it works. At 75% of Americans, including the adoption community, believe things need to change. So we're getting some basics here with this, but when we asked them all a few simple questions about adoption, everybody, including those closest to adoption, got a C-. So we don't really know. And so that was very telling to us, and this idea of a steady drumbeat of education became a theme throughout this research. Nearly 60% of the adoption community feels like adoption is too transactional. Again, when we look at National Adoption Month, and it's beautiful to see these adoptions finalized, but it's showing a moment in time, an important moment in time, but sometimes we're resting on that and not really seeing the bigger picture. 88% of the adoption community wish that adoption was more focused on the outcome of building a stronger family. So we also noticed that stigma and perceptions are really negatively impacting adoption today. And it's really one of our missions to unravel that and to do that in maybe some unexpected places. And it's great to have the opportunity to talk at the City Club of Cleveland tomorrow to bring our messages out to a wider audience. Perceptions and stigma, we heard a steady drumbeat throughout this perception work in describing first birth parents. Very interesting to see first birth parents who relinquished voluntarily, and then those whose children were removed from their care. Very different opinions on that from the general public, which is poignant and really important to think about. People also hold stereotypes surrounding children who are adopted. This is fascinating. Certain types of children get adopted, certain types of children end up in the situation to be adopted. Very interesting, very telling. This is what I always think of these statistics as something funny. More than 75%, it's not funny, more than 75% of the people believe that we should not advertise your child to be adopted, and I think, what were all the other people thinking? So we talk about rehoming. This is a real thing that happens. It's disturbing. Close to 75% of people believe that we should not be denied the right to access, not the right to adopt based on sexual orientation. So we know marriage equality happened, but we know that there is still a lot of discrimination that happens. The same people are in their jobs today that were in their jobs at the time before marriage equality. It's in getting those professionals to understand the new families and the new individuals coming in to adopt that are coming into their spaces. That hasn't been done. There's a new wave of change and action that has to happen based on some of the things that have been changing. And then 85% of people believe that rehoming should be illegal in every state. Again, I think what was the other 15% thinking? So we talked about, the right to access your original birth certificate. There was a strong support for that. And they also had supported the belief that adopted persons should have the right to access their genetic background. Critically important. I have the slides right here. I hate to turn my back to people. It's terrible. And we're getting through these numbers, and I think it's important. But I really want to talk about some of the bigger concepts that we're now talking about that are different than what I think we've been doing, thinking about it up to now, and using words we haven't used before. So more than half of the public support openness. I got to tell you what, I think a lot of people support it, a lot of people don't know how to do it. So we've been helping ACS, Administration for Children's Services in New York, family court judges, adoption professionals, and legal professionals to understand that their work that they do is critically important and that they have to start thinking about things differently with openness at the center. And then more than half of the people, of the public, supported increased funding for post-adoption services. We know what post-adoption services will do to impact a family positively. There's not enough money and funding to be able to do this. And the people that are charged, the professionals that are charged with doing this work, don't always have the adequate training that they need in order to help families. So some of these concepts, which, when I reflect on my personal experience, I think of my birth mom going into the hospital on the 25th of October. I was born on the 27th. She left on the 29th, and then I went into temporary foster care. And I know this because I got my medical records I shouldn't have in Boston. I wrote a very benign letter and I got them, which was fascinating. So I know every movement of her time in the hospital. This idea of transaction started when I read that paperwork, and I was like, oh my goodness. Well, so then I had my parents who wanted to have a baby and another baby, and they had children already, and but it just felt so transactional to me. This idea of transaction and transformation. So we have to start thinking as a centerpiece that adoption is not a one-time transaction, right? That it is a lifelong transformation. And what goes into that are things like pre-adoption education, post-adoption services, and this idea that over time, your experience with adoption, as it will with many things in life and relationships, will change. We talk about the beginning point of this being options counseling, unbiased, non-coercive options counseling for expectant parents that is not a part of making sure that baby gets moved to an adoptive home if that is not what is important and right. So often we saw that the reason why a mom or a couple can't keep their child is because of resources. So we know also, we'll talk about this in a little bit, money. Most uncomfortable part of our tour when we talked about money. Made people very uncomfortable. But if we don't start getting our heads around the impact of money on our systems, we're going to keep making the same mistakes we've made. And guess what? There are still people today that don't tell their kids that they're adopted. Okay? Happens all the time to me, more than you would believe. Education, we'll talk about that. And then last but not least, in this idea of a lifelong journey. In that journey, you have to have community. This is why this Adoption Network Cleveland work is so critically important. Putting human rights next to this experience, right? Putting this idea of basic human rights. Like, when we start talking like that, I think people listen in a different way. When you talk about access to your original birth certificate and your health history, something that everybody else can have and you can't have, that's a human right. Right? When you feel like you haven't had all of your rights explained to you, and there's coercion and you're a birth parent, that is a lack of humane behavior and human rights. Rehoming, right? I mean, my goodness, if there's anything that sits with this idea of human rights, having a child transferred illegally without the regulation or the oversight of the law, And this has harmed children, we know this. Thank goodness an operation like Reuters put the years in and the time and the investment in figuring this out, because nonprofits like ours don't have the bandwidth to do that. So thank goodness that they were able to do that, but my goodness, we were, just also blown away by we knew some of this was happening. We had no idea the depth. And then last but not least, if you haven't been seeing this, there's a gentleman that is about to be deported. He is a Korean adopted person. He never was naturalized as a United States citizen, along with many other, and there's a loophole in the Child Citizenship Act from 2000 that left out, from 2000 on, if you're adopted into this country from another country, you're automatically a citizen. That didn't happen for a number of people. And if you commit a crime, you're getting deported. And so, talk about human rights. You're going back to a country that you don't know, doesn't know you don't know the language. Children are not commodities. This is tough, man. People don't like to see this. People don't like to see those extra dollar signs on a different color baby, right? Okay? We don't like that, but guys, this is, and you have to start talking about this. Something that's I've learned more so now in these last few days than ever is we have to start seeing what is really going on. We cannot deny the realities. When you start putting money next to some of these transactions in such a way, this is how we feel as adopted people. We feel like a commodity. And then it puts everybody at risk of not having a fully formed relationship in a way that's healthy. Okay, so this is a tough one, but it is so critically important we start looking at it. And you know what? No one wants to do anything about it. No one wants to think about this. I've talked to business people. It's a really tough one. So we need more research. This is an area that we do need more research. We do need an economist. We need someone to look at what is really going on, not only in private domestic adoption, intercountry adoption, but also in foster care. There is money. And it's sometimes being channeled in the right places, but more often than not, there's not enough of it, and it's not being used appropriately or wisely. Lack of uniformity. I knew some of this going into this work, but my goodness, it's all over the map. You have some families going to another state because it's a shorter revocation period. You have some people moving from state to state and losing their services. You have some children moving from state to state and losing their ability to access records and information. It's confusing. It doesn't help families. This idea of a sweeping national standard is not realistic, I get that, but there are pieces and parts that are, like a national home study standard. There are pieces and parts we can pull out that will set the tone for what we can do to help make this more uniform and set the expectations so that people aren't confused, children are not harmed, and that the rest of the world sees this experience as well for what it is. And when we don't, just real quick, when we don't have uniformity, that's when you have the ability for unethical practices to come into play. And then the other piece of this, which is much more broad than some of this exact work, is this idea of no reform without education. If people only got a C- on a very simple quiz, what do we know about adoption? What do teachers know about the children that are coming into their classrooms? How are they helping to understand what their experience is and the family trees and all the things that are part of education today, and that young people, whether they're from adoptive families, not this third-party reproduction, is divorce and remarriage, there are blended families, who are the children coming into classrooms and what do teachers know? So much education there. So that's fundamental. But also doctors, right? And medical professionals. Private adoption, you're in the delivery room. Who does the professional talk to? The birth mom or the adoptive mom, or both? How do we get better at doing this? And this is also about realistic images in the world and realistic depictions of adoption, not the Hallmark the Hallmark movie moment. There's a great movie, and I thought of you, Mimi, when it's coming out soon. We're going to screen it in New York privately before it opens, called Lion. It's a Weinstein film. If you see it, I would tell you this, go see it, go as a group, and talk about it. Do not see this movie alone if you're a member of the adoption community. It's heavy, it's beautiful, it's one of the best, it's based on a true story. So it's one of the most poignant adoption films I've seen in a long time. It's going to get a lot of attention. So this idea of education is also about what are people seeing? How are they holding it? What do they think about adoption when they see shows like The Fosters or This Is Us or some of the content that's out there and some of the content that isn't so healthy maybe? What are they seeing and how can we represent our voices there? Education also means participating and sharing your voice in our gallery, on different, in documentaries and anywhere you can so that people know what your experience is. I can stop here because I feel like these to me, there's more, we went on a tour, you know this. I just want to see if there's anything else before I wrap up, just so that we can rest on this, on some of these topics. Oh, I do, I'll tell you what, this is my favorite. I'll end here, a real up moment. So 2 years ago, I think, 2 years ago, we did a social media listening experiment during National Adoption Month. And what we found was 71% of the conversation on Twitter during National Adoption Month was about pets, and 29% was about people. So until we start, I mean, I love pets, don't get me wrong, and pets, bring so much to our lives. There's no question. But my goodness, I love people more than I love pets. And if we don't start understanding the impact that we have, and that our families represent, and the work that we do, and the impact of on not just our families, but the extended family adoption and the extended family in the world, then we just got so much further to go there. But in a time where we're going to be experiencing family for many hours throughout the weekend, and we think about what we have to face now as a country, it's now more than ever that we are feeling that center of gravity, realizing that the foundation of humanity is our family, and what are we going to do in service to our own families, and then to the family that we have outside of in the world. So I'm grateful that I've had time with you. I'm certainly open to questions and conversation, which is what where the magic happens, I think. So happy to give a mic or yeah.
So questions for April?
I once gave a talk to young people, and there's a school in New York called Churchill, and it's a school for learning disabilities, and 40% of the children that go to that school are adopted. So I gave a talk, and I was terrified because it's young people, and you know how it goes. So I said, I'm going to talk a little bit, I'll tell you a little about myself, and then if I don't get a question, I'll do an interpretive dance. There was a young man in the front row, and he turned around to the group and said, do not ask a question, I want to see her dance. There's that. So if there's no question, you know what's going to happen. So there's one here in the okay, I don't know.
Hi.
Hi.
Very pleased to meet you, and I think the kind of work you do is so invaluable. But I just wanted to ask, what do you see as far as reform for, I'm an adoptive parent, and, one of the things my husband at the time and I decided was to adopt within the United States. I mean, a lot of people that we knew were adopting outside the United States, but we thought, charity kids at home, and we thought there's plenty of children, in this country that need to be adopted. Yet I have to tell you, all of our friends who went abroad got their kids in relative ease. We went through 5 adoption failures. Took over 3 years before I was able to get my first son. And so I'm just kind of curious as to, do you see things as far as trying to expedite the process here and maybe even safeguard the adoptive parent from, I have to tell you, it was probably one of the most difficult things I went through in my life.
Sure. So it's a great question. So as I mentioned to you, we have this work that we're doing in open adoption and openness in adoption, and part of that is, so getting at some of this, right? So first of all, we have to unravel years of societal stigma, shame for adoptive parents, for first birth parents and adopted people. We haven't done things so well over these years, so we're unraveling a lot. One of the things I think is critically important is this idea of having the educational conversations with adoptive parents that aren't happening enough now, and also with birth parents. It's the starting place has to be, this is what this experience is now. First of all, there's a lot of inconsistency, there's a lot of lack of efficiency in adoption today domestically, if you're going through the foster care system. And there are some reasons for that. I don't know if you adopted privately or privately. So there's some inconsistencies and some inefficiencies in the private adoption space as well. And I think a lot of what we're seeing a movement towards is a much more open and candid conversation from the beginning, so that first of all, the adoption process doesn't take as long. And not to say that it shouldn't take a long time, these are important decisions to be made. But if you go into it with a clear understanding of what is happening as an adopted parent, as a first birth parent, as an expected parent, that's a starting place that is really good, that we haven't been good at for a long time. And what comes with this experience that is real, which is disruption, failed adoption, and sometimes just a lack of, and they're great professionals, but sometimes just a lack of professionalization of these processes that safeguard everybody. And I'm so glad you asked the question about adopted parents. I feel like you guys get the short end of the stick a lot of the time. And I'll tell you what, throughout the whole tour that we did, I felt uncomfortable for adopted people, myself, adoptive parents, birth parents, professionals, and that was the idea, but I feel, because we wanted to like really get us into stuff, but I feel so often that adoptive parents don't have enough information. They're seen as sort of, the ones that are, in charge, but they never really are in charge, like someone else is mediating some of this, and there's a lot more factors. So we have a lot of work to do, but the good news is we're learning about these experiences. There are voices that are talking about things. There's groups like Adoption Network Cleveland that are like, this is what this is, and talking about what happened and how it could have been better is critically important. We have a lot of work to do in professional development and doing this in really ways. And guess what? We're going back into agencies now that very much have closed adoptions, and people saying, my goodness, what did we do? So we're learning all these different pieces and parts, but I feel you, the process has to change and get better. Not necessarily quicker all the time, but better, well-informed, so that people can make good decisions with good information. And, by the way, the international adoption system, even with the Hague Convention, highly corrupt. And I'll tell you what, in the last, I've heard from 3 young people recently, not because I asked them, because they were talking about their experiences. All will tell you in their own way, not on purpose or not for any reason, but just like, this is my adoption experience. They were all taken illegally out of their countries. So, there's some reasons for why some of these things happen, but they're not always good.
Yeah.
Is that helpful?
Very.
Okay.
Thank you guys. Hope I get this right. My name is Anthony Blanco. I was an adopted person. I came through foster care. 6 foster homes, 1 adoption network, made it all the way up to this point. Thanks so much. My question is, how do we make it more transparent? Because during the time before, I was caught up in that era of 1968 to 1996 where the adoption records could not be open. But thanks to you guys, they were finally open. And I wanted to say thank you all for that for tonight. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate that.
So, the transparency thing is like I was getting at a little bit before, like this idea. So I asked my parents recently a couple of questions, same questions, separate, did this thing for the Huffington Post. Both of them said their greatest joy wasn't when they had my brother, my oldest brother and their first son. It was when they found out they were pregnant with him, because there was so much stigma and shame in the time that they were married, that they weren't pregnant yet and didn't have a baby yet, that it was too much for them. So I think some of the stigmas and the shame and the secrecy has been about not being so good at understanding our identities as individuals, as parents, and what society puts on us to say, you have to be very this way, you have to, because I mean, that's changed now, but I think that wasn't that long ago. So I think we're unraveling, and I've been saying today, parents and professionals have the unique opportunity to conduct adoption without secrecy or shame. Like, we have that ability now, because we know it doesn't work and it's not good, but we're still unraveling what we have been so deeply rooted in as a society and as individuals that wasn't that long ago. So I'm with you. I believe transparency is the best way to go too, but I still think it's hard for people to understand this, and we're coming through it now, but it's going to take all this energy and all the work that we're doing to unravel that. Oh, my bad. To raise their hand and say, I'm having trouble with my kid, and call the child welfare system for help. Yeah, not many. So, there are places that do readoption, and they do it, and agencies will have families come back when adoption disrupts, that happens. But these were illegal. Terrible things happen to the young people. And now there's a subset of the people in that who do this and do bad things to kids. I would say some of these parents were desperate, out of money, out of resources, not informed, and really at their wits' end. Not condoning it, but this idea of illegal child custody transfer, unregulated, is the worst part of not having a system that informs parents, that gives them resources, that checks up on them, and that makes sure that children are safe. And it's a nightmare, it's a travesty. Thank you for reminding me and telling more about that.
Last question. So you talked about getting more information from birth and first parents on just our experiences and things like that. Is there a plan in place for like 2017, or is it still kind of being talked about, or do you just know that you need to know more?
There's a few things. So first, we have just completed one of the biggest, if not the biggest, I think it is the biggest academic research study on on birth parents' experiences in counseling with the University of Texas at Arlington. So that will be coming out the end of the month, and it's comprehensive, qualitative and quantitative, and we learned a ton from that. So we now have academic research, which we didn't have before, that talks to the experiences of expectant and birth parents and the professionals that serve them. So that's the first thing. We got to know and have some academic rigor around that, so we can talk about what really went on and is going on. And then we have to hear from the voices of first birth parents and expectant parents, and adoptive parents, and then the idea of open adoption has to come into that. We have an adoption experience gallery on our site where we capture that, and anybody's welcome to go there and share their experience. Now, outside of us, there are lots of organizations and individuals doing projects, writing projects. I'd love to see a birth parent writing project like the anthology that's been happening, and video projects that help to, in writing. You mentioned you're a blogger. I think just sharing your experiences. I've seen this unique space that's happening right now of the ability to share in ways we never could before, getting the academic research, being more open to different family forms, and the stigma of, of parenting and women's health and reproductive rights, all this stuff. This is all energy that's leading to a place of more transparency, better experiences for everyone, and more open dialogue about what really goes on with us, and then what we need to do to heal and help, and then raise great kids together. That's the whole idea, right? Yeah. All right. I think that. Oh, well, sorry, tiny, but I guess one. Just one more. That's okay. Sorry. No. Here.
It's really quick. Could you talk a little bit more about first options counseling? I'm an outsider from the community, and just how do you think it should be done with first mothers? You kind of talked about some coercive things that you think happen.
Yeah.
I would just like to hear.
Sure. So, I think first and foremost, there has to be. So this idea is that, and when some of this work we're doing with the group back in New York. Some of this is about just opening the dialogue, in private adoption, opening up sooner, and as something to discuss that could be a transformational process for you and your child and the parents that will adopt them, and to really help understand what this means. This doesn't, and decide, like, we all have a voice in this. It could be that you do letters, it could be that you are in touch, it could be that you, one couple I know adopted, and they're in an open adoption, and the company that one of the gentlemen worked for agreed to fly the birth mother of their child in once a year as they moved to Hong Kong. So, we're starting to get better at some of this, but it's about having a facilitated, clear, transparent, candid dialogue about what this really means and committing to it. Having laws in place don't really legislate relationships. Law could say one thing. I've very rarely seen a judge overturn an adoption because of lack of visits through open adoption, and very rarely seen parents go and fight for that. It's just, it doesn't happen as much. It could and should, but it doesn't. And then in the space of child welfare adoption, it's not about getting surrenders more quickly. It's about not TPRing termination of parental rights. It's about doing less of the TPR and more of the working together to find the right solution for children, and making that a transparent and to say this isn't the right thing for either one of you if people aren't willing to work together in that way. And it's being there to support a family when the visits stop for whatever reason, because guess what? Sometimes people move, sometimes they decide it's too much, so it's being there for that family when it starts to disrupt. So the beginning is, though, information, education, conversation, and the ability to really understand what this is going to mean to everybody, and most importantly, to the healthy development of the child.
Sharon, were you asking about options counseling as well, or openness?
Options.
Options. So can you talk a little bit about pre-adoption?
Sure. So what we'd like to see is more, first of all, discussion about family preservation, and the idea that if there are available resources, that family should stay together. Okay, like that's the place you start, because you see so often parents will say, I can't keep my child because they don't have enough resources. So we start with that space of, okay, what are they available? Could you parent this child? Is there an extended network? The other thing that we learned as a sneak peek to the research we just did in this area was that the biggest disappointment for expectant parents during this process was that their families were not there for them. So if their families would have been supportive, they might have been able to keep their child. So then talking with interactions and partnerships with organizations and with women's reproductive health to say, there are other options out there, like Planned Parenthood, to really talk through what other things you could do in the array of experiencing an unintended or unexpected pregnancy. And adoption isn't the only option. And it's really being insightful about that, and not having it be sort of a one-dimensional conversation about an outcome that someone else thinks is right for the child, but that parents arrive at together. And so we have information. It's about changing the behavior, and a lot about the professional behavior and what they're doing in service to families in this area of the first place. This is the starting place, right? It's without a parent making this decision initially, there's nothing to talk about in adoption. So we have to make sure that's sound and careful and informed.
Thank you. We'd like to take a little token of our appreciation. Thank you.